So in this video, we are going to jump into Hypertext Markup language, or HTML, which is one of the three languages that we saw last time that underpin front-end web programming in the browser. So HTML is all about the content of your page. So we saw examples of putting some text in between this special syntax to denote that this text is a header or to denote that this text is a button. So we're going to go ahead and open Visual Studio Code and create our first pages that have this kind of content in HTML format. So first things first is I want you to find a spot on your computer where you can store these projects. So I have a CodeSprint folder for this class for this semester. Into that, I'm going to create a new folder called HTML Quiz Game, and this will be the spot where we can put future projects as well. So we've got this folder, there is nothing in it, and now we want to open it in Visual Studio Code. And there are a couple ways to do this. So in Visual Studio, you can go File, Open Folder, and then navigate to your folder. Or you can, if you've got your Explorer or Finder window open, you can just grab this folder, drag it over here, the window will reload, and then you will now see the name of your folder over here in your sidebar. So this sidebar allows us to create new files and new folders inside of this folder that we have created, HTML Quiz Game. So let's create index.html. This is going to be our home page. We're not really going to fill this in right now, so we can leave it. And then let's also create about.html, which is the page that we are going to work on today. So with this sidebar, if we click on a file, we will open that tab over here in the editor area. And if you need more real estate, you can hit Control-B to hide your sidebar or show your sidebar. Or if you reach over here and get the horizontal resize cursor, you can just drag to resize your sidebar. So I'm going to leave mine open, and I'm going to make sure that I'm in about.html. And we're going to type in our first HTML elements. So for now, just follow along with me, and we'll deconstruct these in a second. So I'm going to type in a less than sign, h1, close that with a greater than sign, and Visual Studio is automatically, because it knows I'm editing HTML, going to put in a closing tag for me for that h1. And I'm going to put the text about me in between this opening tag and this closing tag. So H1 stands for heading level 1 or heading of importance 1, and there are H1 all the way through H6 elements. So I could put an H2 underneath this for a heading of level importance 2 and put my name in it. Then let's throw a horizontal line in here. So we're going to create a HR, horizontal rule element. And let's also put a paragraph, so a P element in here, and say we're learning HTML together. And drop in a thumbs up and save this file. So now we want to open this file. We have an HTML file with a couple elements in it, and there are two ways to open it. One is we can open this file directly in our browser. So I'm going to right click on about.html, reveal in File Explorer, double click about.html, and my browser window will pop open here. So we can see, let's bring these side by side. We've got our H1, which is our heading level 1. It's showing up as big and bold. Our H2, slightly smaller, but still bold. Our horizontal line, and then our text of our paragraph. So this looks great. Well, it doesn't actually look great yet. When we learn how to add some CSS, we'll be able to style this. But we can see that this is loading through a file URL, which looks different than, when you go to google.com, it's https://www.google.com. Here we're actually seeing c:// desktop, blah, 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 about.html. So this is actually reaching into my hard drive and loading a file in the browser, which comes with some security implications. Browsers will lock down some of the features because you are loading from a local file. And what you really want to do anytime you're working on a web project is load your project through a local server. So we talked about servers last time, and a server, is a computer. Like in the Amazon example, they have a bunch of computers that are hooked up to accept requests over the internet. And when a request comes in, it gives you some content. So like when we go to Amazon.com, we get back an HTML page that is the landing page of Amazon.com. Here, what we want to do is, instead of loading through a file, we want to have a little local server that's not hooked up to the internet, but is just set up on our computer, so that when we request about.html, we get this HTML file passed back through the server, which means that we won't hit those security restrictions with opening up a file directly. So if you followed up the setup that we went through for Visual Studio Code, you will have a local server extension called Live Server. So if you right click in your file, you can hit open with Live Server, or you can open up your command palette, which is Control-Shift-P to open it up, and then start typing Live Server. Just type it, oh my goodness, just type it correctly. Open with Live Server here. Either way, you will pop open a server, and we will see the same file, same structure. The difference is the URL. So now we are accessing this over our local IP address and port. So this is our local computer, and this is the port that we are running our project on. So now we're getting about.html from the local server, which means that we're not going to hit those security restrictions. So you always want to load your projects through a local server. This loading it from a file is really something you shouldn't do going forward. And this should be easy to do with the Live Server extension. So let's actually take a second and deconstruct this code that we just wrote. Dismiss these notifications. Let's take a screenshot of this, and we can start labeling it in a whiteboard. So I'm going to take a screenshot. Let's hop over to our whiteboard, paste it in, make it a bit bigger. Okay, so all four of these things are HTML elements. And an HTML element is generally composed of an opening tag, like our H1 here, some content, followed by a closing tag. Closing tag. And the difference between the opening tag and the closing tag is the added / here. So we have about me, we have some markup around it to indicate that's a heading of importance 1 or of level 1, and then we have a similar thing here, except that instead of H1, it's H2 and my name. So then we have our HR here, which is a slightly different beast. So this is a self-contained element, or a self-closing tag. So we can see that it's got the opening and closing all together. There's no content there. And there are a couple elements that we'll see that are like this. And then we also have our paragraph element, which has the opening P and closing P. At this point, you might be wondering what other types of elements are out there. And there are a whole lot. And because this is a crash course, I can't show all of them to you in an example. So one of the most important things most important skills that you can pick up is the ability to read documentation and search out answers. So two really good resources for this. They are W3 Schools. If you just Google search W3 Schools, there's an HTML section. So they have an HTML tutorial, but also if you scroll down on the sidebar here, they have a tag list, which is all of the HTML elements that are possible. So we can see here's our H1 to H6, and it will give you a little example where you can try it yourself. So here we have some sample HTML on the left, and we can change it and then run it and see the result on the right-hand side. So this is really helpful for learning some of the basic syntax and playing with the basic syntax of HTML elements. There is a more formal definition and usage. So it's telling us that H1 is the most important, H6 is the least important. And then there's browser support, which tells you which browsers currently support this element. For a lot of HTML elements, we're going to have good support across the range of browsers. For newer, more experimental features, this table will be really important for figuring out whether or not you can use it in your project. So let's take a look at the HR. So I'm going to scroll down here to HR. We can see that this is a tag used to indicate a thematic break in HTML, often displayed as a horizontal rule. Here's our browser support, and let's also look at paragraph, so P. So we can see denotes a paragraph, and browsers usually add a line break before and after, and you can see some more examples here of different paragraphs. So anytime you are working on a project, you should usually have one of these, as you are learning HTML, open, one of these reference pages. So W3 Schools is one of them, which is a really good beginner one. The other one that I like to recommend and get people to use is MDN, so Mozilla Developer Network. So for instance, if I search MDN H1, that'll take me to the Mozilla Developer Network page for H1. So we can see similar documentation. It's giving us a description of what the element is. It's showing us an example and the rendered output. It has a little bit more specification around what the element is, attributes that it takes. Then it has some more examples of different ways to use it, some accessibility concerns. And one thing I want to highlight while we're on this page is that H1 through H6, these headers, the intent with the headers is that you start at H1 for your most important information, and then you can think of your page as kind of an outline view. So if your page is all about beetles, and then you have a section on etymology, distribution, evolution, those next sections should be H2, and then the section below that should be H3. And some of this is for accessibility reasons, like if someone is visiting your site and they use a screen reader because they're visually impaired, the screen reader uses this basic structure, the semantic meaning of the tags you chose, to build a representation of the page for your user. So it's really important to think about which elements you're using, especially when it comes to H1 through H6. Okay, so the main point here is MDN, W3 Schools. These are both really good references. You should have one of them pulled up as you're working. And anytime you see a new tag, you should go ahead and pull up the documentation to look at the tag, the usage, especially if you're trying to think, oh, I want to put this new thing on my page, like I want to put an image. Well, maybe I'll search through here and see if there's anything that looks right. So here we go. We've got Img. So the Img tag is a way that we can put an image on the page, and then this will have a description of the image, the attributes, some examples, etc. Let's flip back to VS Code and start improving our About page. So right off the bat, my editor is complaining about what we put in here. This is actually not properly formatted HTML. So we're going to use something called emit to give us a skeleton for our HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and grab all of this, and I'm going to cut it with Control X. And then I'm going to type an exclamation point. And we're going to get this pop-up here where I can click on this emit abbreviation, or I can hit Tab or Enter, and it will fill out a HTML skeleton. So emit is a helpful tool for this kind of text expansion where you can type something simple. Like if I type P and then hit Tab, it's going to give me a paragraph element with my cursor in between it. If I hit exclamation point and Tab, it's going to give me this HTML skeleton. So we've got the skeleton. Let's collapse so I can hide the contents of elements here using the folding in the sidebar. So this first line is telling the browser that we are using HTML version 5. So HTML is this language that evolves. It has different versions over time. It's a standardized language. And this is the syntax for saying, hey, we're using HTML5, which is the latest version at the time of recording this. So there are other ways to say I'm using like HTML4. We're not really going to go into that. So that's the first line. The next section is HTML. So here we are creating an element that is going to contain all of our HTML code. And into that HTML, so we have the opening and closing tag, we are going to have two elements. We're going to have the head and the body. And you can see as I'm hovering over this, Visual Studio is giving us some reference from Mozilla Developer Network. It's telling us that this is the body of the document, and if I click on this link, it'll go ahead and open up that in the browser. So that's a quick way to get to the reference page for elements as you're exploring. But the body, this is where we put the content of our website. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in that content that we created before. And the head is for meta information. To instruct the browser information about how the page should be rendered, the title of the page, some information about the character set. So we're going to walk through this. This first one here is telling the browser which character set we are using in our HTML. Here we're using Unicode, which is a good default choice. This next tag is telling the browser about the viewport. So the viewport is the area of the page that the user can see. So you can think of like your mobile device. It's like the screen of your mobile device. That's the window into your web page. And this tag that we have set up here is a useful base for building responsive pages, so pages that look good on small devices and big devices. Basically, it's instructing the browser to say, you know, whatever your normal default is, I'm telling you that this page has been designed so that the width of the page is equal to however big the device is. So if that's a mobile screen, it's probably going to be a small width, and if it's a desktop screen, it's going to be a fairly large width. So this is important to let the browser know, you know, we have thought about device width as we were designing this page, so it should work on different screen sizes. Then we have the title here, which this will, if you save the page to your bookmarks, will show up as the name of the page by default, or this will also show up in your browser bar. So I'm going to say quiz game, and let's do -about. And so we can go ahead and flip over to our browser. Save this. So we have the same content in here. The difference is that the tab up here now has quiz game -about, and our page has stopped complaining about our poor syntax. The browser will do a lot. Like the page that we had before was technically not proper HTML, but our browser will go ahead and fill in the blanks. So sometimes you will forget to close a tag, and it won't necessarily break things in the browser because the browser is doing some work to fill in your broken syntax. You should avoid those, and anytime you're getting errors with those like squiggly lines, like what's called linting, you should try and fix those. So let's start working on improving this page and introduce a little bit more syntax. So first thing that I want to do, let's get rid of this horizontal rule. We're not going to need it. And let's go ahead and introduce the idea of a comment. So a comment looks something like this, where we have an opening and a closing. It's similar to our tag structure with our H1, H2 paragraph. The difference is that whatever we put in between this section is ignored by the browser, is not rendered, and these are just for notes that we leave to ourselves and to other developers who are working on the project. So I can say comment, this is a comment, it is ignored by the browser. And if I save this and check out the browser, you can see nothing has changed about the page. So it's essentially like this content doesn't exist. So comments, the hotkey on Windows is Control / for commenting out lines. So if I select multiple lines and I hit Control /, it's going to put a comment that turns all of this code into a comment. So this can be useful for quickly toggling off code. And you can see as soon as I save it, it disappears from the page because, again, that stuff has now, we've told the browser, don't render any of this. And if I go back, I can uncomment that by using the same hotkey of Control /. So comments are really useful when you are describing what your code does. And one thing when we're learning can be useful is to just sort of lay out some information about what we've learned as we're writing this code. So for instance, we could say H1, this is a header of importance level 1. Paragraph, This is a paragraph. So whatever is useful for you as you're learning to put into a comment, you should go ahead and put into a comment. Let's check this out, just make sure. Yeah, none of this is rendering in the page, so we can move on to the next thing. The next thing I want to talk about is white space. So inside of HTML, the white space doesn't really matter. So I'll throw an asterisk there. We'll talk about some exceptions. So if I add a bunch of space here and hit save, oh, actually, before we even talk about that, we should talk about formatters, because I have my code set up. So as I make changes, every time I save my file, a formatter goes ahead and formats my code so that it has nice, consistent formatting without me having to manually say like indent over. So if I remove the indent here and then save it, my H1 gets indented over so that it's clear to see that it's inside of the body. So the way that we can set this up, if you open up your settings, you can go File, Preferences, Settings, or Control, comma, and then search for Format on Save. And I have mine configured to always format on save. I recommend checking that for your personal projects. It relieves some of the mental burden as you're coding. You don't have to think about the formatting as much because you know your formatter will take care of it when you hit save. So that's how you turn it on. And then if you have multiple formatters installed, like I do, you can open up your command palette and search for Format Document. And if you go to Format Document With, you can choose which formatter to use, and you can configure your default. So for me, and if you followed the setup for that I went through for Visual Studio, you'll have Prettier installed, which is my preferred code formatter. If not, you'll have the HTML language feature, which comes with Visual Studio. And then anytime you save, you get this formatting. But if you, for some reason, like I'm in this situation here where I want to make a change and then I want to save it without that formatter kicking in, I can open up my command palette and say save without formatting and save it. Okay, so now we've talked about the formatter and I've got this ugly white space in between here. So you might expect that if I open the page, I'll see about and then a bunch of new lines and then me. Let's go back here. And let's make sure to save without formatting. You can see what happened. There's just one space. So by default, HTML is going to collapse white space, which means when it sees a whole bunch of white space here, it's going to just collapse that to be a single space. The caveat here is that there are some places where you can actually preserve the white space. Like if you want to display code inside of a web page, it's useful to preserve the white space. Or like concrete poetry would be another place where you want to preserve the white space. There's CSS to be able to do that, but by default you can think about the white space as not mattering for your HTML. So you usually don't want to have a whole bunch of white space because that makes your file slightly bigger and makes it slightly slower to send over the wire to someone's computer, to someone's browser so that they can view it. But in general, it doesn't matter. So we can use white space however we want. Like if we want to space these out so it's easier for us to visually see them as we're coding, that's fine. It's not going to do anything to our page here. Let's start taking a look at some new HTML elements, which will allow us to talk about some new concepts. So let's say that what I want to display here next is, let's give ourselves a new paragraph and say some artists that I've been listening to recently. And then, what we want to be able to put in here is kind of a list. And I want to show, like, say, I'm listening to Elliott Smith and Massive Attack and Jesse Ware. Let's fix that typo. We want these to display as a list. And if we just put them in paragraphs, they're just going to show up as paragraphs on our page, but we actually want something that's like a bulleted list. So if we go back to trusty W3 schools or MDN, we can look for the list elements. So there are two. There is OL, which is an ordered list, which looks like this, where you can denote with numerals the elements. And then there is also UL for unordered list, which looks like this, which is unordered, so it's just more like bullets. And if we look at the definition here, we have UL is used together with the LI to create unordered lists. So that means that we have this parent element, a UL, which opens, and then inside of it, we put these list item elements, these LIs, for each element that we want in our list. So let's go ahead and do that. Create a UL here, and then an LI. And then another one, and then one more. And then if we check it back out in our browser, we can see that that is showing up as a bulleted list. Let's take a screenshot of this, bring it over to our whiteboard, and mark it up a little bit. So grab this UL, copy it, and paste it in. So, a couple things to point out here. We have this general thing that's going on is called nesting. So let's label this nesting. And the reason why it's called nesting is because we have this one element with elements inside of it. So this is the parent element, and this is the child element. And it's common convention, even though we just saw that whitespace doesn't really matter, it's common convention to indent your children over from the parent element. So that's why we have this UL here, which lines up with its closing tag, and then all the child elements are indented over by one. And actually, if we flip back over to Visual Studio, we can see that this nesting has been happening from the top here. So we have, this is the parent of everything, this is our HTML. Then there is the body and head. And then inside of the body, we have this UL, which has a bunch of LI elements nested within it. So nesting is one of the fundamental pieces of HTML. So let's look at another element, which will allow us to look at some more fundamental pieces of HTML. As we talked about, the hypertext part of HTML stands for, or means the fact that we have text documents that are linked to one another. So let's learn how to create a link. And the way that we do that is with the anchor element, which the tag name is A. So if we look at an example, we can see that we have an opening tag and a closing tag, and there's this new piece of information in here. This is called an attribute, which we'll look at when we code it ourselves, but that ends up creating a hyperlink that when we click on it takes us to a new page. So we can see the definition, we can see some information that, by default browsers will style links differently based on whether you visited it or not, or whether you are currently clicking on it or not. And they're well supported across browsers. And then there's some description of these attributes. So we're going to use some of these. One we're going to see is the href, which specifies the page that the link should take you to. And another one that we'll use in a second is the target, which says where does that page open. So let's flip back to Visual Studio and let's say a TV show that I've been watching is Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. So right now there's no hyperlink here. If I flip back to the browser, it's just displaying salt, fat, acid, heat. Actually, I'm going to grab the page that I want to link to. So this is a cooking show that I've been watching. I'm just going to grab the URL to the website so that I can use it in a second. And what we want to do is wrap this text, not the period, but just the text salt, fat, acid, heat, in an anchor tag. So I'm going to start it there and then end it here. And if I save it and reload the browser, this is now an anchor tag, but because we haven't said where it goes, it's not actually showing up as a hyperlink. So I'm going to add that attribute, href equals for hypertext reference, and then I'm going to pass in the website, save it, and you can see now it is a hyperlink, and if I click on it, it takes me to the website for salt, fat, acid, heat. So let's add another attribute. So hyperlinks can also get a title attribute, which we specify, let's say, a cooking show recommendation. And the way the title works is that it shows up here when I hover over the hyperlink. And if we look back at our documentation, let's look at the target attribute. So this is telling us it specifies where to open the linked document. And if I click on it, it's taking me to an example that shows me how to use it, where I say target equals, and it's one of those possible values. It's either blank, self, parent, or top. And if we choose blank, this is telling it to open in a new tab. So let's try using that. Target equals, and then underscore blank. Save it, flip back, and now when we click on salt, fat, acid, heat, it opens in a new tab. You know, one word of warning here is that you usually don't want to use this target blank because you're taking away a choice from the user of your website. And for reasons of accessibility, it's useful for the user to always be able to control where the target opens. But we're doing this for a demo of getting to see how attributes work. So let's do the same process. We're going to take a screenshot. We're going to dissect this. And actually, I'm going to change the formatting slightly here so that it's a little bit easier for us to see. And now let's take a screenshot. So with this, we have nesting again. We have a paragraph tag, and then inside of it is another tag, an anchor tag. And this anchor tag has new information. So these previous tags that we were writing didn't have any attributes. There was nothing else inside of the opening tag, but a hyperlink has a couple attributes here. So usually a hyperlink is going to have an href attribute. So I'm going to label this as the attribute name, and then in quotes over here is the attribute value. And when you have multiple attributes, you specify them in the same way, where you have name equals and then the value, and then a space, and then the next attribute. Title equals value, and then a space, and then the next attribute. Target equals value. And for HTML elements, there are usually attributes that you can specify. There are some that are common to all HTML elements, like ID and class name and style, which we'll see. And then there are some that are specific to, say, our hyperlink here, where we have href, which really only means something for anchor tags, for hypertext reference. And if you go back to your browser and check out either the Mozilla Developer Network page or the W3 schools, they will have a section that lists the attributes. So if you're ever curious what you can specify in terms of HTML attributes, you just always go back to the docs and take a look at the different attributes and their definitions. So let's add a new element. Let's look and figure out how to add an image element. So this time, let's use the MDN documentation. So I'm going to search for MDN image. And we are looking for this document. So we can see that this embeds an image into our HTML document. Here is a sample. We can see that there's image element, and it is one of these ones that is an opening tag without a closing tag, or a self-contained element, and the closing slash here is optional, the one that we used for the HR when we wrote our HR. we can see that there's this source, which looks like it's passing in a path to an image, and then there's this thing called an alt. And if we're curious about what any of those are, we can just scroll down and look, read through the documentation. So we're seeing here it's telling us the source is required, and it's the path to the image, and the alt is a description of the image, but it's not mandatory. It is useful for accessibility purposes. So we're going to make something that looks like that. Can scroll down. We can see some of the other attributes for image elements. And then if we keep scrolling, we can see some examples. So the first one is a basic example with the source and the alt. And then if we keep going down, there are some more complex examples, like using source set, which allows you to define multiple resolutions of images that should be delivered based on screen sizes. So there's a whole wealth of information in here that is useful for working with images. I am going to go to a website with some public domain or royalty-free images that I can download. You can grab an image from anywhere if you have one on your computer that you want to put in your website, or you want to go to Giphy and grab a GIF. Go for it. So I'm going to go to cliply.co/browse. And let's see what we got. Since we're making a quiz game, maybe this one is a good one with a bunch of thinking faces. I'm going to go ahead and download it and extract it. So this particular one came with a GIF and 2 PNGs, and I think I'm going to load the animated GIF onto the page. Windows is taking a second to load this. Try again. Come on, Windows. There we go. So this is the GIF that I'm going to throw onto the page. What we want to do is make sure that we take this image and put it into our project. So pop open Visual Studio again. I want to make sure that it is in my HTML quiz game project folder. So you could do this by just revealing in File Explorer and copying and pasting your image in. I'm going to do this all within the sidebar here. So it's common practice to organize some of your assets by type. So for instance, I'm going to create an images folder, and into that images folder, I'm going to go ahead and drag this emoji. So I've now got it in my project, and I don't love this file name. This is quite large, so I'm going to call this thinkingface.gif. And so on Windows, you can hit F2 to rename, or you can right-click and then go down to rename to change the image. So I've now got my image in my project folder here, and we are going to create an image attribute, an image element here. So img, and then the source that we specify is a path. So this could be a path to something that's hosted on the internet somewhere. So it could be https cat.com/cat.jpg. Or it could be a local path to a file that we have, which is what we're doing here. So this path is going to be relative to wherever this HTML file is located. So we've got this about.html here. So if I want to say, look for something next to this inside of the images folder, I'm going to say // to mean look next to this file. And then I'm going to say, look in the images folder / thinkingface.gif. And let's put some description here. Let's say this is the trivia game icon. So if I save this and flip back to my web page here, we can see that my image is loaded. The GIF is playing. If I, for some reason, messed up and made a typo here and sort of did thinking, we are going to get the alt text showing up, and it's going to show us a broken image. So make sure that your path exactly matches where that file is and its file name. I'm going to fix this, and it should be working again. So one thing that is useful, since we're talking about making errors here, if I happen to make an error, like forgetting the greater than sign here for this closing paragraph tag, you can see that the color of our document has changed. And this coloring from Visual Studio Code is called syntax highlighting. We're going to have it in our HTML, our CSS, and our JavaScript. And it is showing us this, it's highlighting elements of the syntax of HTML. And as soon as we see like the color getting funky here, that is usually an indicator that we have messed up the syntax in some way. And this may or may not break our page. Like here, it worked until we hit the end of that paragraph, and then the browser did not know what to do with the rest of the document, so it just threw it out. So this syntax highlighting and the linter, if you have it enabled inside of Visual Studio, are useful ways to give you some feedback as you're writing your code, whether you've written it properly. Okay, to finish off the content for this page, I want to introduce a couple of things. And these are elements that allow you to structure the overall layout of your page. So we're going to add a header. So we have header, footer, and main. These are the three that we're going to be using here. And if you're ever not sure of what an element is, you just flip back over to MDN or W3 schools, and you can look through the tags to find the one that you're curious about. So for instance, if we wanted to look up what a header is an element that contains like the introductory content or a set of navigational links. And the footer is similarly, it is the bottom of a section. And then the main is for the actual heart of the content. So for instance, a header for a page like ours might look like we have maybe a logo here, and then we have a nav. So span, this is just a container for some text. A nav is a container for navigational links. And inside of here, we can put a couple of anchor tags. So I'm going to put one that is, let's say, the quiz, and one that is the about me. And inside of the footer, we can say something like, I'm going to put in the copyright symbol. And the year. And then inside of main, we're going to go ahead and throw all of the rest of our content. So inside of Visual Studio, there's a thing called line bubbling, which allows us to more easily move content around. So for instance, if I go select a line or select multiple lines, I can hold Alt and then use the arrow keys to bubble that line elsewhere. So I'm just going to throw those comments up at the top of the page. I am going to open up our main, and then I am going to select all of this by clicking at the start and then holding Shift and clicking at the bottom, and then bubble this up into our main. Okay, so we've restructured this. We now have a header, a footer, and the main content of our page. Let's look at what we've got. So we have this header at the top with placeholder for our logo and the links to get around our website. Websites often have a navigation bar at the top that takes you to the different pages within the website or application. And then if I scroll down to the bottom, we have our footer here. So let's actually, for our logo, why don't we throw in a bunch of thinking emoji and save this. So we've got those. We've got our links, but right now these don't actually take us anywhere when we click on them. So with our hrefs, we saw before that we could put in a URL to an external website. We can also put a URL, like here, a relative URL that specifies another HTML document within our project. So when we click on quiz, we want to actually go to this homepage, index.html. This is where we will go ahead and put our game logic. So I'm going to say this is the placeholder game HTML. We're not going to really make a full document here until we come back to actually make that page, but let's go ahead and for the href, we're going to specify a relative path. So we're saying start at wherever about.html is, and then just go to index.html. And for our about me page, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to say about.html. So if I save this and go back here, we can see we've got our quiz and about, and if I click on quiz, it takes us to that placeholder. If I go here and click about, it's not going to do anything because we're already on that page, which is fine. So let's go ahead and throw in some comments here to explain what we just did. So let's close that. So we can say that a header is for intro content like navigation, logo, search form, etc. Span is for what's called inline text. We'll talk about what that means when we get into CSS. We've got our nav, which is for navigation links. Space these out so I can add a comment in here, and inside of a nav element we will nest inside of a nav we will nest anchor elements. Save this. The main, let's put a note here to say that main is for the main content of our HTML page. And let's scroll down to the footer, and we can say the footer is for supplemental info like copyright, contact, additional navigation, etc. So these comments, these are a bit verbose because we're still learning. So we're trying to make sure that we have notes about what we just wrote, what it does. And none of these change how the page is actually laid out. So we go back to it, still looks exactly the same. So what I would challenge you to do at this point is, we've covered some of the basic elements, lists and paragraphs and images. Grab another element from this HTML table of elements and try using it. Or try using an element that we have already used, like an image, and use it in a new way. For instance, try pausing the video now and see if there are any other attributes for images that you might be able to use that would be useful. So I'm going to pretend that you did pause it and did that, and I'm going to talk through it a little bit. So before we wrap up, if we look at image and look at the attributes table, there is width and height that we can specify. And we can see that in an example here that we can try ourselves. So we've got this width and height, and if we try changing it, we can see that now this is 300 pixels wide, 600 pixels tall, but it's stretched out. And if let's try removing the height and just using the width. So we can kind of intuit, or we can read through the documentation to see how the width and height work. But basically, if you specify one dimension, the other is set based on the image's aspect ratio. So we could say our height is 600. And we will have a non-stretched out image. Or we can specify both, and then if we specify both, we just have to be mindful of the aspect ratio. So if we wanted to go back to our site and say maybe we want this image to be a bit smaller, flip back here, we could specify the width equals 300, and we've got a smaller image. Okay, so that wraps up HTML. Our basic introduction to HTML. We have the content of our page here, but it's not particularly pretty, and it is not easy to look at. So we're going to learn how to use cascading style sheets, or CSS, to improve the appearance in the next video.